Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Emily Stevenson, your online membership manager, and I'll be moderating tonight's event featuring Eric Holst, our Associate Vice President for Working Lands. Before we get started, we just have a couple of housekeeping items. I want to first call your attention to the box marked Q&A to the right side of the slide area, which you can also make visible by clicking the purple Q&A icon in the dock at the bottom of your screen if you lose it. Throughout the presentation, you can enter your questions there, and we will get to as many as we can in the bottom half of the hour. If we aren't able to answer your question on the air, we'll research it for you and get back to you in our follow-up email after the event. You'll also see a teal icon with a clipboard in your dock. That's a quick 4-question feedback survey that we hope you'll complete before signing off tonight to let us know how we did. And I think with that, we're just about ready to begin the presentation. Tonight, we are joined by Eric Holst, EDF's Associate Vice President of Working Lands, and I will now turn things over to him. Eric?
Great. Thank you, Emily. And it's great to have everybody here. Thanks for your support for Environmental Defense Fund. It's really important, and I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and one that we're working very hard on, and that's monarch butterfly conservation and all the issues associated with that. So the plan here is for me to give a bit of an overview, a few minutes just to set the context of EDF's work on wildlife conservation broadly and the monarch challenge specifically, give you a bit of an overview of the status of the monarch and then sort of zoom in on what EDF is doing to try to remedy this situation. And then I'll close with a few, sort of recommendations on what folks can do to help address the problem. And then I think the highlight for me of this hour will be taking your questions. So please cue those up if anything is confusing to you or of specific interest to you while I'm speaking. Just fire those off, and then Emily and crew will sort through them, and we'll spend a good amount of time answering questions. So here we go. So the monarch butterfly is a really important critter. It's probably the most famous critter that we have in America. It's widely recognizable, very well known. And unfortunately, it's in decline. The story of the sort of fate of the monarch is really, I think, one of the great conservation dramas of this decade. Let me tell you a quick personal story of how I became aware of this problem. It's actually been only about 5 years that I've personally been really aware of the decline. Now, I'm a professional conservationist. I do this for a living. I read journals. I go to conferences. But the decline, which was well underway 5 years ago when I learned about it, had been underway for about 25, 30 years. And I was a little bit shocked, honestly, that I was shocked at myself for not really keeping up on the problem. And we dove in to start studying this problem about that time and have been working on it pretty hard ever since. We've really ramped up our efforts in the last year, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing. But I think in the same way that I'm becoming aware of it, fairly recently, I think a lot of folks in government, in academia, in the farming community, in conservation are becoming aware of this, and I think there's a lot of action that's taking place right now to sort of reverse this decline. And there's some pretty important policy decisions that are coming up very soon as well, including a potential listing of the monarch on the endangered species list. So why is EDF working on the monarch? I want to give you just a quick overview of that question. It has to do with what we call working lands. So the mission of the program that I direct at EDF is to reverse habitat loss on America's working lands. So what are America's working lands? Let me show you a map here. This is a really interesting map of it's a representative of land use in the U.S., kind of using the U.S. map itself as the sort of guide. This was published last summer by Bloomberg. It shows in sort of broad categories how we use our land. The yellow, the green, and the brown basically represent what we call working lands. These are farms, ranches, forest land. These are lands that are largely dedicated to producing food, fiber, and energy. So the yellow is pasture land, the green is forest, and then the brown is cropland. So all those combined are what we call working lands. The blue is a category that shows on your screen. It's called special use, but that includes parks and preserves. It also includes military bases, things of that nature. But parks and preserves, so what we would think of as national parks, state parks, wilderness areas, are probably maybe a little less than half of that blue stripe there. So if you think there's a lot of attention when it comes to conserving wildlife on protected lands, but it's a relatively small part of the footprint of the U.S. And that vast area, which is probably something like 3/4 of the total land base of the U.S., is in a working lands condition. So that's why EDF focuses on that. That's a place where some of the best conservation opportunities exist, and frankly, where some of the greatest risks are. And our view is that if we can move conservation outcomes on those lands, that can be a great contribution to the overall wildlife challenge. The parks and preserves are critically essential, and there's a lot of other organizations that are working on those conservation challenges in those areas, and we've focused on this other part of the landscape. So that's why. So why Monarch? Why Monarch on working lands? Well, Monarch is kind of an iconic species that for wildlife conservation on working lands. It actually depends entirely on these working lands for its survival. Monarch is kind of a gregarious butterfly, and it can thrive in urban areas, but it particularly thrives in agricultural landscapes, places where there's lots of sort of rich habitat and lots of moisture and availability of the sort of wildflowers and milkweed species that it depends on. So it's really kind of a great model of the kind of species that we are trying to work on to protect wildlife on working lands. And the actors on working lands are farmers and ranchers and people who manage forest land. And so our challenge is really to kind of work with that community to come up with conservation strategies that give us good outcomes. And so the Monarch becomes a sort of great example of the kind of work that we're trying to do across the working landscape of the U.S. So now I'll switch to a little bit of a picture of how things are going with the Monarch right now. So this slide tells a couple stories. One, that we have two distinct populations of monarch butterfly in the U.S. There's the much larger population, it's what we call the eastern population, that breeds on the east of the Rockies, and it overwinters in central Mexico. So that population was probably over 1 billion individuals 30 years ago. It's declined to its low population in the winter of 2018 to about 50 million individuals. We had a bumper crop of monarch in the last year, and it actually doubled in size for this season, up to over 100 million individuals. That's the estimate. But the long-term trend is still a decline. So we're thankful and hopeful that the trend is reversing. But the long-term trend for that larger eastern population is in decline. There's a separate population on the West Coast, and it's much smaller. Probably at its peak, it was around 1 million individuals. It's down to under 20,000 individuals now. And this was a really bad year, this last year. So in contrast to the eastern population, the population on the West Coast is really at the brink of blinking out. So these are the trends that we're trying to reverse here, and working hard in both the eastern population and the western population. I should mention the western population, for those of you that live on the West Coast, overwinters in the central coast of California. So some of you may have visited Pacific Grove, Monterey, Santa Cruz. There's clusters of overwintering monarch there. That geography provides sort of the same climate conditions that are present in central Mexico. So these are generally separate populations. They share the same genetics. They share some of the same environmental challenges. But obviously there's different conditions that are driving the success or the lack of success of the two different populations. So we set a goal a few years back that we were going to help be part of the solution, bringing populations back to the level where we think they were stable and that could avoid a listing on the endangered species list. And so the population target is, for the next 10 years, is 225 million individuals. This was a target set by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about 2 years ago. And so we have run some models that project the level of habitat enhancement that we think is necessary in order to hit that target. And so we think that roughly requires about 3 million functional acres of habitat. We are carving off for ourselves and our agriculture partners about half of that. So what you'll see here is a goal of restoring 1.5 million acres, functional acres of habitat on working lands. And we think that the other half of that acreage goal will come from other strategies, including transportation, rights of way, increasing public land, backyard gardens, urban parks, things like that. So the goal that you see here is EDF's goal of working with the farming and ranching communities to restore 1.5 million functional acres. The functional acre, without going into too much depth, is a measure of the quality of acreage at the same time you're measuring quantity. So a functional acre can be thought of as sort of a perfect acre for monarch. If you had two acres that had half of perfection, that would equal 1 functional acre. So our total goal may actually touch more than 1.5 million actual acres. So as I mentioned, our partners here are farmers and ranchers. They own and manage the majority of the land in the U.S. They have the most available land. And so we're trying to devise strategies that can make it in the interest of farmers and ranchers to take the edges of their field, irrigation ditches, roadsides, different parts of their fields, and put it back into the kind of habitat that we need to bring monarch back to a thriving condition. So what is that habitat? I mentioned that monarch breed and multiply in the U.S. during the summer and fall, and then they migrate back to their overwintering grounds, and the eastern population goes back to Mexico. But scientists believe that a big part of the constraint in the decline is due to poor breeding habitat in the U.S. And a lot of that is just due to the fact that we've dedicated so much of that landscape to cultivated crops and things of that nature. And so we actually need to bring back more of this. It's basically kind of a prairie habitat that includes wildflowers and a special kind of plant, milkweed, which monarch depend on for breeding. So think of this as sort of what we might call grasslands. And monarch have this need for the presence of milkweed, which is a very kind of unique plant, and then a bunch of wildflowers, or what we call nectar plants, that provide the fuel for monarch to move around the landscape. And so we are developing programs, partnerships with farm organizations like the National Corn Growers Association and different other crop associations to encourage their members to get this habitat on the ground and to provide them technical assistance, in some cases financial assistance. We're working with state and federal government to devise programs to make it easier for farmers to do this. And then we're closely watching the decisions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is considering whether or not to add the monarch butterfly to the endangered species list. They have a deadline of June of this year, 2019, to make a preliminary determination. If the species is listed, it would trigger some mandatory protections that would come along with that. And if it's not listed, that's not necessarily a permanent decision. We can revisit that at some point in the future. And so we're really trying to encourage the agriculture community to get out ahead of this problem, get busy with habitat enhancement as much as possible now, so that we can recover these populations. So the most important breeding habitat is the Corn Belt, right up the middle of the country. If you're familiar with I-35, scientists believe that that corridor, which runs from Laredo, Texas to Duluth, Minnesota, is roughly equivalent to the sort of most important breeding habitat of the monarch butterfly. But it really occurs in all 48 states. And if you're up in Vermont or Maine, you'll see them up there. They definitely breed throughout the U.S., but the most important habitat is right up the spine. It's the most productive breeding ground, and it's where we're focused the most of our attention right now, from Texas, which is the first stopping over point after the overwintering period, up through Minnesota. And then in California, smaller population, which moves out from the Central Coast into the Central Valley and the Sierra Nevada and in over into Nevada and Oregon and Washington and Idaho. Our focus is right now on the Central Valley, which is kind of the equivalent of the Corn Belt on the West Coast. It's sort of very intensive agriculture, a lot of opportunity for enhancing habitat, and so we're working here to enhance that habitat in the Central Valley. So I'm going to move to questions here really quick. Just real quick, what can you do to help in addition to your support for EDF, and we appreciate that. There is really no disadvantage to everybody, on whatever piece of land that they have access to, whether it's a small pot on your porch or a little backyard garden, or if you have more property, getting out the kind of habitat that monarch need. And so planting locally adapted species of milkweed is very important. And then planting any kind of a nectar plant, a wildflower that provides nectar to monarch and other pollinators as they're moving through the landscape is really critical. So I think there's other opportunities to get involved with the monarch count. If you're on the West Coast, there's opportunities around Thanksgiving and Christmas to participate in monarch counts. One of the reasons that we're so familiar with the status of the monarch is they do overwinter in fairly tight geography, so they're easy to count. And then that can be a really helpful way to kind of get on top of this problem. And a lot of the work that we're doing is with folks that are operating on thin margins and they need financial support to get some of the habitat on the ground. So we're working with a bunch of partners to try to raise additional money for direct on-the-ground conservation. So that's just another area. So Emily, why don't I stop there and move to questions, because I'm really anxious to hear what's on people's minds.
Great. Thank you so much for the presentation. We've got a lot of great questions that have already come in, so we'll dive right in. This question is from Gerard, who asks, where can we get milkweed plants, and is there an organization that supplies them?
Yeah, so there's a bunch. So first, you want to, any milkweed will help, but the best choice is to get milkweed that's sort of locally adapted. And so the best way to find that is to talk with folks locally about the right species, and there's a concept called Ecotype, which is basically a way of getting seeds and plant material that is adapted to your local environment. There's an organization called the Xerces Society, Xerces spelled with an X, which has been really one of the leaders in making folks aware of the monarch problem and the monarch solutions. And they have a Seed Finder website. And Emily, I believe there's on the document.
Yes, there's an icon, this little picture of a monarch butterfly on your dock.
So that'll take you to the Xerces Seed Finder website, and then you can. I looked at it just before that. It covers opportunities for. They're basically commercial enterprises that sell, or nonprofits that sell seed or plant material. Covers most of the country. There's some gaps, so if there's a source near you, that's where I would start. And if you live in one of the gap areas, it's worth giving it a shot. Maybe going out and getting seed from a source that's not local and seeing if monarch use it. There's no harm in doing that. So that's what I would encourage.
Our next question is from Patricia, who asks why we're depending on farmers when there are so many homeowners who are willing to help.
Yeah, so EDF is working on with farmers and ranchers for the reasons I described. We're trying to focus our efforts in the place where we think we can get a big point of leverage. If you answer, sort of with the royal we, the conservation movement that's trying to bring monarch back, we collectively, definitely there's a focus on homeowners. and not just homeowners, but other land managers in urban areas or suburban areas. Again, monarch they're not sensitive to the noise or the presence of people like some species, and so you can really make a difference by providing milkweed and nectar plants in backyard gardens and all kinds of nooks and crannies. Some of the best habitat is along railroad rights of way and cemeteries and things like that. So I would encourage everybody to get involved.
Our next question is from Samuel. It says, hello, I'm a Western Washington native, and I recall that the Western monarch population was especially at risk. Is the problem largely the same for both populations, or is there something more specific or a specific area in the West that we should be keeping our eye on?
Yeah, great question. So, some of the factors are transferable. The decline of milkweed in the environment, I think, is a problem in both cases. And the decline of generally of wildflowers in the landscape is a problem. Although if you're in California this year, we're having a wildflower explosion, so hopefully that will help the butterflies. We are actually there's somewhat of a mystery about what's driving the Western population to decline more rapidly. We had a meeting at University of California, Davis about 2-3 weeks ago where we brought in scientists to try to wrestle with this mystery. And unfortunately, we don't have a precise answer. So we are just like good detectives trying to sort of experiment with different theories. One of the theories, and I won't go through all of them, but one that I think is quite compelling, which we're concerned with, but also trying to see if there are remedies, is it has to do with the timing of the departure of monarch from their overwintering ground, and how that corresponds with the timing of milkweed germination and sort of availability. So this could be something that scientists believe may be driven by climate change, where monarch are receiving cues to leave their overwintering ground earlier, maybe because of average temperatures at a higher level, and they're going out into the landscape looking for milkweed to breed on, and they're not finding it because the milkweed is not responding in the same way to those temperature signals, those climatic signals. So that's in sort of a phenological problem, and it's not necessarily one that's easily solved. There's anecdotal evidence of this. Scientists are looking into it in more depth. One of the professors at UC Davis showed photos of, if you can imagine, a 3-inch or so milkweed stem with 2 or 3 monarch caterpillars on that tiny little stem. And so that was, was taken in about this time at some point in the past, and you've got monarchs sort of out there looking for resources that aren't available. So that's one thing that might be driving a problem on the West Coast that isn't quite as large of a problem on the Eastern population. But we're looking at other factors too. It's possible, some speculate that the wildfire smoke that was quite abundant at the time that the monarch were returning to the Central Coast last year might have created some problems and confusion. So there's a whole suite of theories, and we're working with scientists now to try to get on top of that.
I'm going to do a pair of questions next from 2 people who are on the same wavelength. Cheryl first asks, what can the backyard gardener do to protect the monarch caterpillars so they can live to the next stage? I had many caterpillars on my milkweed, but one day they were gone. I guess the birds eat them. Is that right? And along the same lines, Abby writes, I like to attract birds to my land via feeder. Am I endangering the monarch butterflies that come to my yard by increasing their risk of being eaten by birds? What kinds of birds eat monarchs?
Yep, great questions. So, all right, so let me tackle the question of predation on monarch first. So monarch have this unique feature, and one of the reasons is that they have this special relationship with milkweed is that milkweed has toxic sap. If you break open a milkweed plant, it'll have this, sort of milky sap that includes chemicals called cardenaloids, which are actually quite toxic to most critters. And monarch has developed this amazing characteristic of being able to sequester in its tissue those toxins, thus making itself toxic. So a monarch caterpillar is not something that you want to eat. It'll have this high concentration of cardenaloids in its tissue, and one of the reasons for its bright coloring and its very sort of recognizable coloring is that birds, if they do eat a monarch caterpillar, will tend not to go back and eat it because they'll be sick, or if they eat too much of it, they could die. So the monarch are not particularly susceptible to predation from birds, although they will eat. Some birds will eat a monarch caterpillar once or twice. Some may develop, kind of just as with humans, they have some birds that might have a sort of strong gut, and observers of monarch overwintering groves and some of the breeding grounds have noted that there are individual birds that are quite clever. I was recently in Mexico visiting the overwintering grounds, and the guides down there were telling us that clever birds, I don't remember the species name down there, will pick through they'll catch a monarch and then pick through its tissue to get at the part of the tissue which is less toxic. So it tends to be the outer tissue that is more toxic and the inner tissue that's less toxic. And so some clever birds have figured out how to do that. General story, I don't think bird predation is a huge threat to monarch because of their clever protection strategy. So I wouldn't worry about attracting birds to your garden. I can't explain why a caterpillar would just disappear. It could be also predation from rodents and things like that. I think pesticides are probably a bigger threat in home gardens. I think there's a lot of, and I'm not suggesting any of the folks on this call would do that, but I think a lot of urban gardeners are misusing pesticides of different kinds, and I think there's a real vulnerability. Monarchs are pretty sensitive creatures, and I think to the extent that you can keep chemicals out of the garden, I think that's going to be better for the monarch.
That's a great segue into our question from Susie asking, to what degree will planting 1.5 million functional acres be undermined by pesticide use by the farmers and ranchers?
Yeah, great question. So this is one we're really we're wrestling with now. To some extent, this can be you can mitigate the threats to new habitat by creating some sort of divide or proximity, or distance from an area where pesticides are being applied. Now, it's a challenge in some parts of the country. In Iowa, for example, we mapped out the landscape, and if you applied, say, a 50-foot buffer to every cornfield or soy field in Iowa as a protective buffer from pesticide application, it would exclude almost all of the remaining land in the state. So we've kind of come to this view that we need to allow farmers to plant habitat for monarch and other pollinators pretty close to their operations, their existing crop operations, and then encourage what we call best management practices to minimize drift or any sort of movement of pesticides into that habitat area. So it's about using integrated pest management best practices. It's about using new technology to minimize drift and movement of chemicals into habitat areas. It's about timing, doing it at the right time, so that if you can avoid applications at a time when monarch or other pollinators are present, that's important. And we have to recognize that there will be cases where individuals will be poisoned, or there'll be sort of a diminution of health because of exposure. So because monarch we can't stop them from entering these ag landscapes, we have to be encouraging the production of as many monarch as possible. And so it's kind of a tough challenge as a conservationist to make these judgments about where the right location is. But we think if we can get enough habitat and really educate the ag community in these best management practices, that'll net be the best strategy for monarch.
We have gotten about a dozen questions, I would say, in the last few minutes. from people asking about, and forgive me for probably not pronouncing this correctly, Ophriocistis electroscura parasite, and also tachinid flies, which may be the same thing. I'm not sure. So I'll let you speak to, everyone's kind of asking what can be done about that, and are there particular, tactics that backyard gardeners can take to reduce the threat and that kind of thing.
Right. Okay, yeah, you got a sophisticated audience here, so a good pronunciation on the what's more commonly called OE. It's a pathogen that is present in the monarch population that it's not necessarily fatal. A lot of monarchs have this OE pathogen in their tissue. It basically diminishes the vigor of an individual, and it might affect their ability to breed, to lay eggs, to move through the landscape with as much power and strength as an uninfected individual. So the presence in the population is really one of the problems that is out there for monarch. What can individuals do about OE? I think the most practical thing that can be done is to avoid planting what's called tropical milkweed. So there are a number of milkweed species that come from the tropics. They and especially if you live in an area like a coastal area that doesn't freeze. So there's a problem of tropical milkweed harbors this OE pathogen at a higher rate than native milkweed. And so monarch that are utilizing throughout the growing season, which for a tropical milkweed in a coastal non-freezing area is year-round, the scientists have found that there's a higher concentration of OE in those individuals. So the recommendation there is to either not plant tropical milkweed, although it's quite ubiquitous in a place like the LA basin, it's everywhere. The recommendation then is to cut it back in the winter. So if you cut it back to the ground and it comes back in the spring, you can really kind of push down the OE populations. So if you do have tropical milkweed and you're not willing to give it up, cut it back in the winter. If you live in a freeze zone, it'll die on its own. So for example, Art Shapiro is one of the great butterfly experts at UC Davis. Has publicly stated that he doesn't recommend people eradicate tropical milkweed. Just cut it back in the winter if it doesn't freeze. And if you're in a freeze zone like where I live in Sacramento, you can just let it die back in the winter, and you shouldn't have to worry about it. So that's one recommendation on OE. I'm not as familiar with the other the flies that were mentioned. So I wish I could say more. I'll dig into that a little bit, and maybe if you track the EDF Growing Returns blog, I can provide more information on that through the web.
And we can certainly email a link to that out to everyone who attended or registered tonight as well.
Sure. Okay.
Changing gears a little bit, Brenda asks if you could speak to the impact on monarch migration if the southern border wall is extended.
Sure. Yeah, that's gotten a lot of attention. One of the reasons for that is that there is a national butterfly preserve on the border in Texas that the border wall proposal that's been made cuts right through the butterfly preserve. And so in a very sort of high profile and specific way, if that section of the wall is built, it's going to bisect that butterfly preserve and damage habitat. But the broader question, if large sections of the wall are built, will it affect the monarch migration? I think the answer is no. Honestly, they'll fly over the wall. They'll fly through the wall. If it's I think the border wall will be far more damaging to other species. I know the ocelot is a small cat that occurs right down there, and it kind of moves back and forth. Not knowing where the border is, and I think that could be a problem for some of those other species. But I think the monarch is a quite adaptable critter, and it'll just fly right over.
Our next question is from Marcy, who asks what sort of incentives farmers have to work with us or to adapt their application time of pesticides.
Yep. So. And we're trying to strengthen those. There's a series of incentives that exist right now, and like I said, we're trying to make those stronger. There are financial incentives, and I think that can come in the form of conservation payments that are made to landowners who agree to enhance habitat for critical species. The largest source of those payments is the Farm Bill. I think a lot of people see Farm Bill as the source of subsidy for farmers, but there's also a conservation program, which is the largest single source of conservation funding in the federal budget. And so EDF has worked for years to try to improve those conservation programs in the Farm Bill. There are also, kind of regulatory incentives and hammers. There's sort of, we work a lot in this area of trying to reward the best actors and then create, sort of in effect punishment for those who are not acting with, as much good faith. And so in the area of Monarch, I think watching this Endangered Species Act listing is something to keep your eye on. Again, the preliminary determination will be made in June of this year. It may be delayed a little bit because of the government shutdown, but it'll happen sometime in June, July, in that time frame. And we've specialized over the years in working with farmers and ranchers on conservation problems in the year or 2 or 3 years before a listing decision. There's a real incentive to avoid any kind of regulatory increase if you're a farmer or rancher or any kind of business owner. And so we found that we can kind of step in and help industries address a conservation challenge when that threat of a listing is fairly nearby. And so that's driving a lot of our partnerships right now, trying to help these industries address the possibility of a listing and take actions to avoid, to grow populations in an effort to avoid the listing. So that's another category of incentives. There are a bunch of others. I'll mention one more, and that's really kind of it's an incentive that recognizes that when you're planting habitat for monarch and other wildlife species, you're also actually enhancing other environmental benefits that come out of those landscapes. And it might be flood control, flood mitigation, it might be water quality, purifying water that flows through the landscape. So if you think about some of these intensively cultivated ag landscapes, most of the land, 95% or more of the land, is dedicated to producing crops. There's very little native vegetation in the landscape to provide the ecosystem benefits that native vegetation provides. So, one of those benefits is habitat for wildlife. But once you get that native vegetation down into the soil structure, the roots of native grasses and wildflowers and trees and shrubs are actually providing a sort of filtering function. And in some situations, the roots can kind of pull water down into the landscape to help mitigate for drought in dry years. And they can actually increase the absorptive capacity of soils to mitigate flood risks in wet years. So clarifying that and creating quantification of those benefits can also serve as another incentive for farmers and ranchers to be involved with these sorts of programs.
Our next question is from Monica. We live in a community and gardeners come to cut the grass. Sometimes they use pesticides. Do you recommend any resources that they could share with their community to convince them to use less harmful chemicals?
Yeah. So that's a great one. So we haven't worked directly with the kind of landscaping community in cities and towns. I'll give you an example of a related a sort of group that we've worked with that I think might draw some lessons then for educating the sort of landscaping community. So we've developed a program called Monarchs in the Rough. Are there any golfers on the call? Monarchs in the Rough is a program that provides technical assistance, advice, and seeds to golf course superintendents. And we have something like 200 or 300 golf courses enrolled in this program now. So they get a package of technical and direct plant material, technical assistance and plant material, and then some advertising material and linkage to a network of other supervisors that are doing this kind of work. So if you think about a golf course as sort of like a big backyard, you've got landscapers, people cutting grass, controlling weeds, managing the lawn in one way, managing the roughs in another way. And what we're trying to do is encourage habitat in the roughs. So this is, this network of golf course superintendents and their staff are probably some of the most sophisticated landscapers out there in America today. And the ones that are really trying to enhance habitat, I think, are drawing lessons that can be applied to, to commercial landscape operations. Folks that manage large business parks and city parks and things like that. And then I don't have a good sense right now, just having not thought about this in the past, of then how do you trickle that down to, kind of the mom and pop landscapers that are, kind of moving from home to home and cutting grass. But that's got to be a solvable problem. I think it's first a technical problem, getting the advice together to make sure that there's ways to, effectively, manage, weeds in the landscape and pests, and then moving that down through the, that industry to get it to the right sources. I'll say also that an important point of leverage, and one that EDF might be able to work on, is the chemical providers, those companies that are providing the fertilizer that has embedded within it pesticides and herbicides. That's another point of leverage where it probably makes more sense for an organization like EDF to work on, is to influence the kinds of products that they're putting out there, and maybe even working with the retailers, companies like Home Depot and others that are kind of getting these chemicals out fairly easily to folks. I think there needs to be a little bit better process of education for everybody, not just landscapers, but home gardeners who are buying a lot of these products.
We have questions from Peggy, Sharon, and Veronica, all asking about specific other plants besides milkweed that are helpful to monarchs, nectar plants that they could be planting in their gardens.
Yep. Yep. So it's a pretty simple formula. It's some milkweed and a lot of nectar plants. So if you think about, depending on what part of the country you're in, look at the sort of the native landscape. Look at roadside, sort of the places that have some representation of native grassland or a sort of a flower-rich part of your landscape, and then try to mimic that. So nectar plus milkweed, and then think about nectar plants that are providing nectar year-round. So let me just give an example. So let's say you live in Texas. You might be in Dallas or Houston or something like that. Getting advice from local restoration experts or even your nursery about what kinds of flowers are going to be starting to be available about now, in the April time frame. Monarch are starting to move up through Texas right now, and they'll start breeding. And then eventually, a month or two from now, you'll stop seeing them, and it's not because they, it's because they've moved north or they've started moving east. And then, well, hopefully your friends and relatives in Oklahoma and Kansas are doing the same thing, because they're going to be moving up through the landscape and needing those nectar resources and that milkweed for breeding. But they're going to hit Texas again in the fall, so they're going to be coming back through. And as they move, they don't need milkweed in the fall, because they're typically not breeding in the sort of October time frame, September, October. They're just moving. That last generation, which is kind of it's sort of a super generation, it moves up throughout the U.S. and then there's sort of genetic signals that cause that last generation to have a lot of flying capacity, a little bit higher body weight, and they move all the way back to Mexico over winter and then fly back to Texas. So that last generation is a very special generation. But the point is that you need nectar resources both on the way up and the way down. So for example, I just found it before I got on this call, the Xerces Society again, and again that's Xerces, Xerces. You can go into their website and they have a ton of resources. And one of they have a special set of information sheets, which are, I have one in front of me here if I can find it. It's a series for almost every region of the country of monarch nectar plants, and they have a list. So it's a 2-pager with some description on the front. And on the back, it has a list of native species from different geographies across the U.S. of important nectar plants. So I'll just give you an example. I have the one I live in Sacramento, so I have the Inland California 2-pager, and it has 24 species of nectar plants and 3 or 4 species of appropriate milkweed plants that I can then go out and search at my sort of native plant society or a local nursery to see if I can find those plants to put in my yard. So I just looked at it, Google that. It's the Monarch Nectar Plants page on the Xerces Society website, and it has great recommendations. Xerces is, like EDF, promoting native plants for all these kind of plantings. But just to be practical, Monarch don't require native nectar. They don't require native plant nectar. They will take anything that has nectar in it. So, if you have, and even in my garden, I try to use as many native plants as I can, but it can sometimes be finicky. And there are other species. Rosemary is one, for example, which provides a lot of nectar, a lot of pollinators. Bees love it. Anything that bees are going to love, Monarch will love. There's some competition there. But if you have non-native nectar-bearing plants, those are valuable too for Monarch.
Our next question is from Susie, who asks if the recent heavy flood in Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri will be a problem for milkweed and native nectar plant growth and availability this summer. And a similar question from Carol asking what butterflies do during extreme weather events and how dangerous they are to them.
Yeah, okay, great. So I think my guess, I don't know with precision how the Midwest floods are going to affect Monarch, but I suspect it won't be a tremendous negative effect. I just flew over. I was in Iowa earlier this week, actually, and on the way home, I was very mindful of sort of keeping my eye out for, what the floods look like right along that Missouri River, kind of drainage. And it's tragic. It's having a big effect on a lot of farms and a lot of towns. So don't get me wrong, but from 30,000 feet, there's still a lot of land that's dry, right? So I think in terms of availability of potential habitat, I think it's still there. I think even the areas that are flooded, and this is one of the reasons for using locally adapted, species and ecotypes. They will probably have a way of sort of making it through a flood, because this is an event that, while it's a real problem today, it's not something that was unusual, in evolutionary history. So I think the prairie kind of species that are really important for Monarch in that geography have a way of kind of making it through a flood event. So I'm guessing that won't be the biggest problem that Monarch have this coming summer. What was the second part of the question, Emily? I missed.
Just extreme weather in general.
Weather.
How do butterflies survive that?
How do they cope? Yeah. So so there's a big set of possibilities there. You could be talking about drought. Drought's a big problem for butterflies because it can cause the lack of availability of plant material. If plants are stressed, then the butterflies might be stressed. Incidentally, I'll just give an interesting little tidbit. Heard a talk from Dr. Shapiro at UC Davis a few weeks ago, and he indicated that in California that every species of butterfly that he was tracking did better during the drought in California than, and they started declining again after the drought was over. So that was sort of interesting. We always try to drive our work by science, and that is frankly a confounding result. He doesn't completely understand that. But he thinks it may be related to the fact that a lot of butterflies breed directly near the surface of the ground, and in drought years there may be less, fungus and mold and other things that might have a negative effect on breeding. So anyway, interesting little feature. And it sort of speaks to the fact that we don't know a lot how critters are going to respond to the changes in the environment. But certainly another consequence of drought is wildfire. And that's a major problem in terms of habitat, diminishing habitat quality, and direct harm to individuals. So higher rain events, I think that's going to be a problem. It's certainly going to be a problem in the overwintering grounds. I think extreme weather in central Mexico, when the entire population is back there in sort of December, January, February, is a big problem. And there's there could be a freeze. There was a freeze in 2000. It was either 2002 or 2003 that wiped out several hundred million butterflies. It was sort of the big single event that really kind of caused the eastern population to nosedive. And that's a situation where butterflies don't cope with extreme events. They don't have the capacity to deal with a freeze, which is why they're in Mexico in the first place. I guess I'd love to say that that Monarch have great strategies for coping with all these things. In many cases they don't, and it's one of the reasons why the sort of totality of environmental defense funds work, not just on specific wildlife challenges, but mitigating climate change is really important.
We have a question from someone who's just given their first initial as D, who's asking some of the partners that we work with in our Monarch conservation efforts.
There's so many to mention. I'll try to pick out a few interesting ones and just tell little stories about them. One is the National Corn Growers Association. We've signed an MOU with the corn growers. Corn is a fairly resource-intensive crop. It's grown on something like 80 or 90 million acres across America every year. The management choices of individual corn growers matter a lot for Monarch and a whole other groups of species, and they matter a lot for water quality and climate. And our approach is to try to find actors that have high leverage, have the ability to influence a lot of individual actors. And so trade associations can kind of fall into that category. So we're working very closely with the National Corn Growers Association to create a program that would encourage hundreds, if not thousands, of their members to get involved with monarch conservation. Monarch is a situation where thousands of individual corn growers doing very small changes to their management could make a big difference. And so that's one example. Another partner that we're starting to work with very closely is kind of interesting. It's Pheasants Forever. This is a hunting organization, an organization whose mission it is to grow habitat for pheasants and other game birds because their membership is interested in hunting. We haven't done a lot of partnerships with organizations like that, but what we're finding here is that their staff are some of the most expert biologists in critical landscapes at enhancing habitat, because it's the same habitat for monarch as it is for pheasants. And the real connection there is that pheasants are relying on a lot of sort of small insects and caterpillars and grubs and things like that. And so this nectar habitat with milkweed and grasses is really critical for those game birds. We're partnering with academic institutions because there's a lot of questions that we still don't know the answer to. So UC Davis is one out here in California that's been really key at helping us, form the questions and then initiate research to get at answers. We've worked very closely with Iowa State University in the middle of the country. They have a group of researchers, scientists, social scientists, economists that are really tackling this monarch and prairie restoration challenge. The University of Minnesota has a monarch lab, which for years has been sort of our one of our main go-to labs for answering tough questions and helping us to develop protocols for habitat restoration and quantification of benefits. So I could talk for the rest of our time on that. There's probably 10 or 15 or 20 other organizations that should be mentioned. I'll just close with the Xerces Society, which has been was the organization that I visited 5 years ago when I was just kind of coming up to speed, and I left there with a stack of literature, books and pamphlets, and their website is a wealth of information about the monarch challenges and opportunities.
Just as a time check, I will let everyone know we've probably got enough time for 2 or 3 more questions we'll hopefully get through, but we do have a lot more questions than that. So if we didn't get to your question tonight, we're definitely going to send a follow-up email this weekend with a recording of this event, and we'll try to get you the answers to those questions by then, or if we don't have the answers by then, as soon as we've got them. So our next question is from Sam, who's asking, what are the main differences between the eastern and western populations, and would it be possible to reintroduce the eastern monarchs into the western region if the western population collapses?
Yeah, I've been wondering that myself. So I'm not going to give a definitive answer because I don't think the answer is known, but a couple ideas. reintroduction is tricky. Well, actually, let me answer the question first. What's the difference between the two populations? So genetically, they're basically the same. There's no substantial genetic difference. So it's the same species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife is evaluating the listing right now, and if they list, it'll be for the entire population in the U.S. In fact, there are populations in other countries. There are populations in Australia. There's Monarch in Hawaii. And they're all the same species. So they've done genetics to sort of look at that, and there's very little difference. So no genetic difference. There's some behavioral differences. Obviously there's some genetic trigger that causes a monarch who's bred in Eastern Oregon to return to the central coast of California to overwinter. So why is that? We don't know with precision why that is. And if that same individual kind of got blown over the Rockies, would it end up in Mexico? That's an interesting question. We don't know. There's some interchange between the two species. So there's very little interchange, but we do know that there are probably some weather events, probably in the kind of southwestern desert, where you might have some Eastern monarchs that kind of get mixed up and end up on the central coast of California. So there's a little bit of mixing going on. There's even speculation that the western population exists because of a large weather event that blew a bunch of monarch over, the west to the west coast. So if the monarch blinks out in the west coast, could we reintroduce Eastern monarch, or would they show up on their own? Given some similar kind of weather event, that's possible. I'm sure there'll be efforts to try to reintroduce monarch. They're very easy to breed, and school teachers know this because it's you can raise them in your classroom. So it's pretty easy. But we don't know that they'll replicate the same behavior once they come out. And then I think the bigger problem is that if we don't solve the underlying problem that's causing the decline in the West, even if we reintroduce monarch, we're not likely to have a sort of sustainable solution to the problem. So I think we got to get on top of whatever the threats are that are driving the population decline in the West, having to do with habitat or toxins or some disease factor. So we're really working hard to get on top of that.
Speaking of those classroom butterfly terrariums, I guess you call them, both Linda and Maria have written in asking about whether it's a good idea or a bad idea to bring eggs indoors and raise the caterpillars and then release them once they're adults.
Yeah, so I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that the individual monarch would care whether they were being sort of reared inside or outside, as long as you're bringing in eggs that are from the wild. Now there's a whole industry where you can kind of go online and order a monarch kit. And I think that is more of a problem because it's not a problem to do that. I think it's good for science purposes and teaching and education. But then releasing those individuals into the wild is probably a bad idea because I think you're mixing a very sort of, that's a sort of different genetics, right? Same species, different genetics with probably some disease problems and things that wouldn't be naturally in the environment. So it's maybe roughly analogous to sort of farmed salmon versus wild salmon, that kind of thing. But if you're collecting wild eggs, bringing them into the classroom or into your home, raising them up, and then releasing that same individual into the environment, I think that's completely fine.
Thank you. I think maybe we have time for one more question. David asked how long monarch butterflies live, and the migration with their lifespan seems confusing.
Yeah, okay. So real quickly, we have 1 minute. I'll try to do this in 1 minute. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about the eastern population, and there's a correlation to the west. But so monarch literally right now, and I was down there about 2 weeks ago, and monarch they had started to leave about 2 weeks before that. So that generation that's overwintering in Mexico arrived there from as far away as Alberta, Canada, and Minnesota, and Maine, and Vermont. They flew all the way back 5,000 miles, and they did that last fall. So now those very same individuals are moving back up into Texas and starting to look for milkweed, looking for nectar plants, starting to breed. I think there's already reports of monarch hitting the southern Texas just in the last week. So that generation has been they were hatched and born probably August, September of last year. They are 6-7 months old. But it's a sort of specific genetic trigger that causes that last generation to live for that long. They will lay eggs now in Texas, in the southern part of the U.S., and then that generation will die. Their offspring will move through that just amazing process of egg to caterpillar to chrysalis and butterfly, and that next generation will fly north or fly east, and they will breed again, and they will live 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. As soon as they lay eggs, they start declining, and then they'll die, and that'll happen another 5 or 6 times for the eastern population. So there's as many as 4, 5, 6 generations of monarch, every summer and fall, and then there's some sort of trigger of temperature, light, that causes that last generation to develop, a sort of stronger fortitude, more strength to fly back to Mexico over winter and then fly back to Texas. So hopefully that explains the dynamic. It's roughly the same situation in California, although frankly scientists haven't studied it with as much precision. There may be fewer generations in the West Coast, but fascinating.
Great. Well, this has been
amazing process. Yep. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say this has been like a really jam-packed, informative hour, and I think I had a great time listening to the questions, and I hope that everyone enjoyed it who was attending as well. It's about all the time we have. We'll definitely follow up with all of you by email over the weekend, and before you go, I hope you'll take that quick 4-question survey to tell us how we did tonight. And I want to especially thank Eric for taking time to talk about his work with us, and of course all of you for joining tonight and for everything you do. Have a great night.